1922 Georgia, a stretch of pine forest thick with shadows where dirt roads end and whispers begin. It was here, in the rural outskirts of Telfair County, that the Carter family's quiet life ended in silence so complete it has haunted generations. In 1922, Georgia was a place caught between tradition and the encroaching pull of modernity. Yet for those living in the state's vast rural stretches, time seemed to move differently. The land was thick with pine forests, swamps, and dirt roads that wound like veins into places forgotten by progress. Towns dotted the landscape, some thriving with the promise of the railroads, others fading into near obscurity. Beyond those towns, tucked into the deeper edges of the woods, cabins stood alone, separated by miles of farmland or wilderness, each family living in a world almost entirely their own. It was in one of these remote pockets that the Carter family made their home, their small cabin surrounded by dense trees that muffled the sounds of life, where the isolation was so complete that a passerby could walk the road nearby and never know a family lived just out of sight. Georgia in the early 1920s carried with it a tension both cultural and spiritual. The state was still recovering from the shadow of Reconstruction and the long reach of poverty that bound most farming families to the land. Electricity had not yet reached these secluded areas, and nightfall brought with it a true and almost impenetrable darkness. People relied on kerosene lamps, wood-burning stoves, and their own instincts, for neighbors were not always close, and help could not be summoned quickly. In such conditions, silence was a constant companion. The chirp of crickets, the distant call of a whip-poor-will, the rustle of wind through branches, these were the sounds that kept people tethered to the rhythms of the earth. To lose those sounds, or to feel them disappear suddenly, would not simply be unsettling. It would signal something profoundly unnatural, something that unsettled the human spirit. The Carter cabin was not unique in its construction. One room, perhaps two, built of hand-hewn logs with gaps filled by clay, roofed with tin that rattled under storms. A porch ran along the front, a place for resting after a day's work or for watching the horizon in the quiet moments of dusk. It was not luxury, but survival, the same as so many families had lived for generations. And yet this cabin would come to be remembered not for what it was, but for what it became, the centerpiece of a mystery that unsettled even those accustomed to hardship and loss. The remoteness of the setting was central to its story. For outsiders, the isolation of rural Georgia carried a sense of romance, but for those who lived it, it was a precarious existence. Families like the Carters depended on each other entirely, for sickness or injury could mean disaster when the nearest doctor was half a day's ride away. It was a life where faith, superstition, and local lore filled the spaces left by the absence of answers. Stories of spirits in the woods, of curses that clung to certain patches of land, or of tragedies never spoken aloud, were part of the cultural fabric. Against this backdrop, the silence that would come to define the Carter cabin was not merely a quirk of nature. It was an omen. Neighbors spoke of it in hushed tones, as though naming it too clearly might draw it closer. Silence here meant more than the absence of noise. It was a weight pressing down upon the land itself, as if the trees and the air conspired to keep their secrets locked away. The Carter family lived as many rural Georgia families did in 1922, bound tightly to the land and to each other. At the head was Thomas Carter, a man in his early 40s, lean and weathered by years of labor in the fields. His hands bore the permanent calluses of a farmer, his shoulders bent not from age but from the constant weight of work that never truly ended. Beside him was his wife Margaret, a woman known among the nearest neighbors for her quiet diligence, her garden that produced more than most, and the way she kept the small cabin orderly. Despite the challenges of raising 3 children with little more than the basics of survival, together they worked in rhythm, their lives marked not by clock or calendar but by the shifting seasons, each cycle bringing planting, tending, harvest, and the cold months where survival meant relying on what they had stored. Their 3 children, James 11, Clara 8, and Samuel, the youngest at just 5, were the light of the family's world, though their lives were not untouched by hardship. Childhood in such an isolated place was a far cry from the laughter and play one might imagine. The children's days were filled with chores, learning the small responsibilities that kept a household running, gathering eggs, tending goats, hauling wood, or carrying water from the nearby creek. Yet even within those burdens there was innocence. Neighbors would sometimes glimpse them chasing each other along the dirt path, or hear their faint laughter drifting from the edge of the forest when they thought no one was listening. In such moments, the Carters seemed like any other family, tied by blood and circumstance to the rural world around them. Though hard-working and self-sufficient, the Carters were often regarded with a cautious curiosity by those living in the sparse farming community nearby. They did not attend church regularly, which in the deeply religious South raised quiet questions about their faith. Thomas was not a man given to gossip or community events. He kept his dealings limited to what was necessary, trading crops or labor when the season demanded it. Margaret, too, was polite but reserved, never seeking the companionship of other women in the area. Their children were rarely seen beyond the boundaries of their land, and when they were, they clung closely to one another, quiet and watchful. To some, this made the family seem proud or distant. To others, it was simply a sign of how isolation molds people. Yet there was something about the Carters that unsettled even those who tried not to pay them much mind. Perhaps it was the way Thomas would sometimes stop mid-sentence, staring off toward the trees as if he had heard something the rest could not. Or the way Margaret, when asked about her children, often smiled but answered little, as though words themselves carried danger. Whispers grew in the small community. Some said the family had secrets, others believed they carried an old sorrow best left unspoken. Whatever the truth, the Carters had become both familiar and unknowable to those around them. Neighbors in name, strangers in every other sense. Neighbors first began to notice the change not in the people themselves, but in the land that surrounded the Carter cabin. For years, the property had carried the same sounds as any other patch of rural Georgia. The low crowing of roosters at dawn, the occasional bark of dogs when travelers passed along the dirt road, the rustling chatter of leaves disturbed by wind or small creatures moving unseen. It was a living soundscape, one that reassured people they were not alone in the vast quiet of the countryside. But in the weeks before the discovery, that familiar chorus began to fade. Chickens ceased their restless clucking, as if the coop itself had grown heavy with dread. The family dog, once known for chasing squirrels or greeting visitors with protective snarls, grew silent and refused to cross the porch, lying instead at the tree line with ears pinned back, trembling at shadows that no one else could see. The silence was first dismissed as coincidence, the sort of lull that sometimes fell over the land when the weather turned heavy and storms gathered unseen. Yet this quiet was different. It did not pass, and with each passing day it deepened. Neighbors swore that when they approached the Carter property, sound itself seemed to falter. Their own footsteps, usually sharp against dry soil, softened unnaturally. Voices carried strangely, fading too quickly as if swallowed before they could reach another's ear. Even the cicadas, those ever-present heralds of southern heat, ceased their droning chorus near the cabin. To stand by the edge of the clearing was to feel as though one had stepped into a world drained of life, where the air pressed down so heavily that even breath seemed reluctant to disturb it. The family themselves appeared unchanged to those few who saw them in passing. Thomas continued his work in the fields, though some swore he looked more distracted than before, his gaze drawn often to the tree line as if searching for something. Margaret came to trade flour and salt one morning, and though she spoke in her usual quiet manner, she seemed hurried, as if eager to be done and away. The children were glimpsed less and less. Once their laughter could be faintly heard drifting from the woods, but now even that was gone. When James was seen alone in town, he offered only a brief nod, eyes downcast, unwilling to linger. Superstition clung tightly to communities like this, and it was not long before whispers began. Some claimed the family had angered the land, that a curse had settled over the cabin. Others muttered about illnesses that struck without visible wound, or spirits that demanded quiet offerings. A few dismissed it outright, attributing the stories to the tendency of rural folk to make omens out of shadows. But even skeptics admitted something peculiar lay over the Carter home. Silence itself, in a world where every night and every morning was usually filled with the music of the earth, became the loudest warning of all. On the morning of October 3rd, the Carter home revealed its terrible secret. A farmhand named Elijah Turner had been sent to deliver a sack of grain, a task he had done many times before without incident. He approached the cabin by the narrow dirt track that cut through the woods, expecting to hear the usual sounds of the household, the creak of the porch boards, perhaps the bark of the family dog announcing his arrival. Instead, the stillness was so complete that Elijah hesitated before knocking. His hand met the wooden door with 3 firm raps, but no sound followed except the dull echo against the frame. He called out, waited, then tried again. When nothing stirred, a chill settled over him, and with growing unease he pressed the latch and stepped inside. What he found has echoed through the years with a horror all its own. The Carter family of 5, Thomas, Margaret, James, Clara, and young Samuel, were seated neatly at the dinner table. Each sat upright in their chairs as though frozen mid-meal, their eyes open but glassy, gazes fixed on nothing. Before them were plates of food, a simple supper of bread and stew that had gone untouched. The spoons remained neatly placed, bowls filled, the bread whole. Nothing had been spilled, nothing disturbed, as though the family had paused in unison and never resumed. Their bodies bore no wounds, no blood, no signs of violence. To Elijah, the scene looked less like a crime and more like a family portrait of death, so unnaturally composed that he stumbled back in shock, dropping the sack of grain where he stood. When the sheriff arrived with the county coroner, the details only deepened the mystery. There were no broken windows, no marks of forced entry, and no evidence of struggle. Chairs had not been overturned. Dishes had not been broken. The cabin itself appeared untouched, as though preserved in eerie order. Yet every face carried the same uncanny expression, lips slightly parted, eyes wide, as though words had been forming when life suddenly left them. Some witnesses later said the family looked as if they had been caught mid-conversation, arrested not by fear but by something more elusive, as though they had listened to something no one else could hear. Initial suspicion fell on poisoning. The coroner tested what tools were available at the time, but no trace of known toxins was found in the food or water. The untouched meal baffled investigators further. Why would poison be suspected in food that no one had eaten? Thomas's hands were clenched slightly, not in pain, but as though holding on to a thought unfinished. Margaret's posture was composed, her children equally still, each mirroring the others in eerie symmetry. To those who stood inside the cabin that day, the air felt heavy, charged with a presence that could not be explained. Witnesses later claimed that even their own voices sounded strange in that room, muffled and wrong, as though sound itself recoiled from the space. Word spread quickly through the surrounding farms, and within hours, the story of the Carter family's discovery had become something more than tragedy. It had become an omen. Farmers spoke of the silence that had preceded it, of the unnatural stillness that lingered even after the bodies were taken away. For those who stepped inside, the memory of that table, with its untouched meal and lifeless family seated in eerie repose, became impossible to shake. It was not simply death that haunted them, but the sense that the Carters had not been taken by violence or accident, but by something far more inscrutable, something that left behind no trace but silence. The sheriff's men worked for weeks to find a cause behind what became known as the silent cabin deaths, but the deeper they dug, the more the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet. At first, suspicion turned toward poisoning, the most logical explanation when no wounds or signs of struggle could be found. The untouched meal was collected, samples of water drawn from the nearby well and the soil around the cabin inspected. Yet nothing revealed itself. The crude tests available in 1922 could identify arsenic or other common toxins, but no evidence supported that theory. The food remained pure, the water clean. With poisoning ruled out, the case began to drift into the realm of rumor. In a rural community bound by both faith and superstition, explanations quickly splintered. Some neighbors whispered of curses, claiming the land the Carters lived on had once been the site of an older misfortune. They recalled stories of a family from decades before who had vanished without trace on nearly the same ground, though no records confirmed it. Others believed the Carters themselves had invited darkness upon their home. Thomas's tendency to stare into the woods, Margaret's reluctance to speak openly with neighbors, the children's strange quietness. All of these details were reinterpreted through hindsight, forming a narrative of a family already marked by the unusual. Lawmen did not linger on superstitions, but they could not avoid more worldly theories either. Some suggested a family feud, the possibility that enemies had slipped into the cabin unnoticed and left behind a silent crime. Yet if there had been a killer, why was nothing taken? Why was there no sign of intrusion? Why would an assailant leave their victim seated so eerily intact, food untouched, chairs perfectly aligned? Robbery and vengeance usually left scars of chaos. But the Carter home remained unnaturally ordered, as though death itself had been meticulous in its work. There were quieter rumors as well, less dramatic but persistent. Some speculated that carbon monoxide from the wood stove could have crept silently through the cabin. Though possible, the stove showed no evidence of malfunction, and those who entered the cabin afterward reported no such danger. Others wondered if disease might have struck them down, an illness swift enough to stop 5 people at once. The coroner dismissed the idea, noting that their bodies showed no symptoms of plague or infection. They had not suffered or wasted. They had simply stopped. As weeks stretched into months, theories became folklore. Young men muttered of ghosts that spoke in voices too low for the living to hear, of spirits that demanded silence in exchange for passage. Elders recalled older tales of witches in the woods or spirits bound to places where the earth itself had soured. The lack of answers fed these beliefs until they seemed more convincing than any official explanation. What lingered most, however, was not the truth of one theory or another, but the gnawing fact that nothing solid could be proven. Theories filled the void left by evidence, each one more unsettling than the last, and the silence that had shrouded the Carters in life seemed to extend into death, refusing to yield even the smallest whisper of clarity. What unsettled the community most were not only the unanswered questions, but the things people claimed to hear long after the Carter family had been taken from the cabin. For the first few days, townsfolk visited the site in hushed groups, some out of morbid curiosity, others hoping to find a clue the sheriff had overlooked. It was during these visits that the first whispers began. One man swore he heard a faint murmur drifting from inside the cabin even though the rooms were empty, the kind of low, indistinct sound one makes when speaking from another room. A woman who had stepped onto the porch to peer through a window claimed she heard her own name whispered back to her, though no one inside admitted to saying a word. At first, these accounts were dismissed as nerves, the mind's way of filling the unbearable silence with something it could understand. But as more people reported similar experiences, doubt began to twist into fear. The sheriff ordered the cabin boarded up to keep trespassers away, but that did little to quiet the stories. Local boys on dares pried the boards loose and slipped inside, coming out pale and shaken. They said the air inside was heavy, like breathing through wet cloth, and that no matter how loudly they spoke, their voices fell flat, muffled as though the walls themselves absorbed every sound. One boy admitted he tried to shout, but what came out was no more than a strained whisper, though his throat burned with the effort. Another swore he heard a child's laughter near the table where the Carters had been found, but when he turned, nothing was there. These boys were not known for honesty, but their fear seemed too raw to be an act. Even those who kept their distance said the cabin carried its own voice. Farmers walking the road at dusk claimed that on still nights when the wind dropped and the trees stood perfectly still, a faint cadence of voices could be heard slipping from the cracks of the boarded windows. The words were never clear, a jumble of tones and murmurs like a prayer repeated endlessly in a tongue no one understood. Some said it was the family themselves trapped in the moment of their deaths, repeating the last thing they had tried to say. Others argued it was not human at all, that the whispers belonged to something older, something that had always lived in the silence of those woods and had only chosen the Carters as its vessel. Fear spread so deeply that even passing near the clearing became an ordeal. Travelers avoided the road if they could, taking longer routes to steer clear of what they called the hushed ground. Parents warned their children never to wander near it, though the warnings carried an unspoken recognition that children were drawn to the place precisely because of its dread. The whispers turned the mystery into legend, transforming the Carters' fate from a tragedy into something spectral. Whether they were truly heard or imagined, the murmurs ensured that silence was no longer just an absence of sound, but a presence all its own, lingering, waiting, and reminding the living that what dwelled in that cabin was not yet finished with its story. As the years passed, the story of the silent cabin did not fade. It deepened, spreading its roots into the folklore of rural Georgia. Families who had once lived within a few miles of the Carters abandoned their farms, unwilling to raise children near a place where the line between life and death seemed so fragile. The cabin itself, left to rot after the sheriff ordered it sealed, became a landmark of unease. Boards warped, tin roofing rusted, weeds and vines crept up the walls, but still it stood, a reminder that whatever had silenced the Carters had not been explained or undone. People spoke of it in whispers even decades later, as though speaking too loudly might summon back the quiet that had claimed the family. For the older generation, the cabin became a cautionary tale. Parents used it to warn children against wandering too far from home, weaving stories of the Carter family's fate into lessons about obedience and survival. Children were told that if they strayed into the woods near the clearing, they too might fall under the same silence, their voices stolen until no one remembered them. The legend grew into something larger than the original tragedy, carrying the weight of both fear and mystery. What had begun as a shocking discovery became a parable of the unknown, a reminder that not all dangers left footprints or broken doors behind them. Those who lived closest to the site often claimed that the silence had seeped into the land itself. Hunters said the woods around the cabin grew unnaturally still, as though even animals avoided the area. Men returning from long days in the fields swore that when they passed near the old clearing, they could no longer hear the crunch of their own boots. It was not the silence of peace but of suppression, as if the earth itself resisted sound. Travelers on the back roads sometimes reported the same unsettling hush, their wagon wheels seeming to roll too softly against the dirt, their voices slipping away before they reached their companions. These accounts gave the impression that the Carters' tragedy was not contained to the cabin walls, but had spread outward, infecting the land with its stillness. By the mid-20th century, when new generations who had not lived through the event began hearing the stories, the Carter family had become spectral figures in local imagination. They were no longer simply farmers who had died under strange circumstances. They were ghostly presences, eternally seated at their dinner table, staring into nothing, waiting for something unseen. Some storytellers insisted that the family could still be heard if one stood near the foundation on moonless nights, a faint murmur that rose and fell like prayer. Others said the whispers were not the Carters at all, but a darker echo, something that had used their lives as a stage and lingered long after the curtain fell. In this way, the silent cabin became less about the question of what had happened and more about what it represented. It was the embodiment of the unknowable, a reminder of the limits of human understanding in a world where superstition and reality often blurred. For the people of Georgia, the Carters' fate was not just an unsolved mystery. It was a wound carried through generations, shaping the way they understood their land, their faith, and the fragile thread that separates the living from the silence that waits just beyond. In the quiet of Georgia's pine woods, the Carter family's story still lingers like a breath that never fully left the air. 5 lives frozen around a dinner table, their final moments swallowed by a silence no one could explain. A century has passed, yet the questions remain. Was it the hand of man, the weight of superstition, or something older, darker, that claimed them that night? We may never know. But what we do know is that stories like this, unsolved, unsettling, and half buried in time, remind us how fragile the line between the ordinary and the unexplainable truly is. If this story unsettled you, if you found yourself leaning closer to the shadows, wondering what truths might still hide there, I invite you to join this journey deeper into forgotten mysteries. Subscribe to this channel not just to hear another tale, but to walk with us into the places history tried to leave behind. Your thoughts matter here. Share them in the comments. What do you believe silenced the Carters? Was it a crime, a curse, or something no investigation could ever capture? Each story we uncover leaves behind another door half open, another echo waiting to be heard. With every subscription, every comment, this community grows stronger. More voices piecing together the silences history left behind. So stay with us, because the Carter family is only one chapter, and if silence itself can kill, then what other forgotten truths are waiting even now to be heard?